In the twilight of the 19th century, the world map was a tapestry of pink. The color represented the British Empire, the largest dominion in human history, an entity so vast that the sun never set upon it. From the bustling wharves of Hong Kong to the diamond mines of South Africa, from the icy wastes of the Canadian North to the sheep stations of Australia, Queen Victoria reigned supreme. Her navy, the Royal Navy, possessed dominance over the world's oceans that had not been challenged since the days of Napoleon. London was not merely a capital city. It was the beating heart of the global financial system, the clearinghouse of world trade, and the arbiter of international law. To the British ruling class, the Victorian aristocracy who managed this colossal enterprise from the leather armchairs of their clubs on Pall Mall, the world was orderly, hierarchical, and British. Across the Atlantic Ocean, however, a different kind of power was stirring. The United States of America was a nation that the European powers viewed with a complex mixture of condescension and unease. For most of the century, the Americans had been looked upon as distant cousins, uncultured, loud, and obsessed with their own internal expansion. They had spent decades slaughtering each other in a civil war, then slaughtering the indigenous tribes of the West to secure their continent. But by 1895, the frontier was closed. The American project of internal conquest was complete, and the energy that had driven the pioneers across the prairies was now turning outward. The United States had quietly undergone a metamorphosis. While Britain was policing its far-flung colonies, America was building factories. Its steel output had surpassed Britain's. Its railway network dwarfed the rest of the world combined. Its population was exploding, fueled by waves of immigrants hungry for work. It was a sleeping giant, a coiled spring of industrial potential that had no outlet. The American economy was prone to violent booms and busts, and the Depression of 1893 had left the country angry, restless, and looking for distraction. There was a rising spirit of jingoism, a feeling that America had grown up and deserved a seat at the table of great powers. These two tectonic plates, the descending trajectory of an overstretched British Empire and the ascending trajectory of an aggressive American republic, were destined to collide. The collision point would not be a major strategic hub like the Suez Canal or the Straits of Gibraltar. It would be a steaming, mosquito-infested patch of jungle on the shoulder of South America that appeared on most maps as a blank space. The forgotten dispute. The dispute between Venezuela and Great Britain was one of those colonial headaches that had dragged on for so long that most diplomats had forgotten how it started. It dated back to the Napoleonic Wars when Britain acquired the colony of British Guiana from the Dutch. The Dutch had never really defined the western border of their territory because nobody cared about the dense rainforests of the Orinoco Basin. It was a green hell of swamps and jaguars, impenetrable and economically worthless, but empires abhor a vacuum. In 1841, the British government sent a German naturalist and surveyor named Robert Schomburgk to map the colony. Schomburgk drew a line on a map that would become infamous. The Schomburgk line pushed the British boundary far to the west, claiming the mouth of the Orinoco River, which was the commercial artery of Venezuela. The Venezuelans protested. They pointed to old Spanish maps that showed their territory extending all the way to the Essequibo River. Britain ignored them. Venezuela was a weak, instability-prone republic racked by civil wars and coups. Britain was the master of the world. The dispute simmered for 50 years, a low-level diplomatic irritant. Then came the gold. In the late 19th century, prospectors discovered massive alluvial gold deposits in the Uruguay River region, right in the heart of the disputed territory. Suddenly, the worthless jungle was worth a fortune. The largest gold nugget ever found, famously weighing over 500 ounces, was pulled from that mud. A gold rush began. British miners and settlers flooded into the zone. The British government, sensing revenue and strategic advantage, formalized its claim to the Schomburgk Line and then pushed even further, claiming an additional 33,000 square miles of territory. For Venezuela, this was an existential threat. The British were not just taking jungle, they were threatening to take control of the Orinoco Delta, which would effectively give them a stranglehold over the Venezuelan economy. The Venezuelan government was desperate. They severed diplomatic relations with Britain in 1887. They appealed to the European powers for help, but nobody wanted to offend London. Venezuela realized it had only one card left to play. It had to drag the United States into the fight. The American intervention. The Venezuelan government hired a former American ambassador named William Scruggs as a lobbyist. Scruggs was a master of propaganda. He wrote a pamphlet titled British Aggressions in Venezuela, or the Monroe Doctrine on Trial. He distributed it to every congressman, every senator, and every newspaper editor in Washington. His argument was simple and inflammatory. He claimed that Britain was violating the sacred principle of American foreign policy, the Monroe Doctrine. The Monroe Doctrine, declared by President James Monroe in 1823, stated that the American continents were henceforth not to be considered as subjects for future colonization by any European powers. It warned that any attempt by Europe to extend its system to this hemisphere would be viewed as dangerous to the peace and safety of the United States. For 70 years, the doctrine had been largely theoretical. The U.S. Navy was too small to enforce it against the likes of the Royal Navy, but Scruggs's pamphlet landed in Washington at the exact moment when the United States was looking for a fight. The President of the United States was Grover Cleveland. Cleveland was a Democrat, a conservative, and a man known for his stubborn integrity. But he was politically besieged. The economy was in ruins. There were strikes and riots across the country. His party was losing ground to the Republicans, who were accusing him of being weak on foreign policy. Cleveland needed a win. He needed to show that he could stand up for American interests. His Secretary of State was a man named Richard Olney. Olney was a corporate lawyer from Boston, a man with a bulldog temperament and a deep belief in American exceptionalism. He looked at the map of South America, and he didn't see a border dispute. He saw a test. If Britain could simply redraw the map of Venezuela whenever it found gold, then the Monroe Doctrine was a dead letter. It meant that the United States was not the paramount power in its own backyard. In the summer of 1895, Olney sat down at his desk in the State Department and drafted a diplomatic note to the British government. It would become one of the most famous and aggressive documents in the history of American diplomacy, essentially a legal brief for American hegemony. In the note, Olney didn't just ask Britain to arbitrate the dispute. He lectured them. He wrote that, "The United States is practically sovereign on this continent, and its fiat is law upon the subjects to which it confines its interposition." Think about those words. Its fiat is law. It was a breathtaking assertion of power. Olney was telling the British Empire that in the Western Hemisphere, the United States was the supreme authority. He argued that the British refusal to arbitrate the border was a form of aggression and a violation of the Monroe Doctrine. He demanded a reply. The British response. The note was sent to London in July of 1895. It landed on the desk of the British Prime Minister, Lord Salisbury. Salisbury was a relic of an older age, a bearded aristocratic giant, a man who conducted diplomacy with the weary cynicism of someone who had seen it all. He was both Prime Minister and Foreign Secretary. He viewed the United States as a boisterous, culturally inferior upstart. He read Olney's note with a mixture of amusement and irritation. He dismissed its arguments as legal nonsense. The Monroe Doctrine, he correctly noted, was not a part of international law. It was just a unilateral declaration by one American president. It had no standing in the courts of Europe. Salisbury made a fatal error. He decided to ignore the note. He let it sit on his desk. He went on vacation. He attended to other matters in Africa and the Near East. He assumed that the Americans were just blowing off steam for domestic political consumption. He didn't realize that in Washington the clock was ticking. 4 months passed. The silence from London was deafening. To Cleveland and Olney, this delay was a calculated insult, the British aristocracy looking down its nose at the American Republic. Finally, in late November, the British reply arrived. It was 2 separate notes. In them, Salisbury meticulously dismantled Olney's arguments. He lectured the Americans on history and law. He stated flatly that the Monroe Doctrine did not apply to a boundary dispute between a European colony and an American state. He refused arbitration. He refused to budge 1 inch on the Schomburg line. The tone was polite, but the message was absolute. Mind your own business. The war threat. When President Cleveland read Salisbury's reply, he was furious. He felt personally disrespected. The British had not just said no, they had treated the United States like a child that needed to be schooled. Cleveland decided to escalate. He decided to take the issue out of the quiet corridors of diplomacy and throw it into the public arena. He decided to threaten war. On December 17, 1895, Grover Cleveland sent a special message to the United States Congress. The text of the message hit Washington like a bombshell. In the speech, Cleveland asked Congress to appropriate funds to create an American commission to investigate the border dispute. That sounded reasonable enough. But then came the kicker. Cleveland declared that once this American commission had determined where the true border lay, it would be the duty of the United States to resist by every means in its power, as a willful aggression upon its rights and interests, the appropriation by Great Britain of any lands, or the exercise of governmental jurisdiction over any territory which the Commission had determined rightfully belonged to Venezuela. Resist by every means in its power. In diplomatic language, that means war. The President of the United States had just drawn a line in the sand. He was saying that the U.S. would decide the border unilaterally and then fight the British Empire if they crossed it. The reaction in the United States was instantaneous and explosive. It was as if a match had been thrown into a powder keg. The chamber of Congress erupted in cheers. Republicans and Democrats who had been fighting bitterly over domestic issues united overnight against the old enemy. The press went wild. Headlines screamed war with England and the lion twist the eagle's tail. The Civil War generation, which still remembered British sympathy for the Confederacy, felt a surge of vengeful patriotism. The Irish-American community, which was a powerful political bloc, was ecstatic at the prospect of fighting the British. In New York, Boston, and Chicago, crowds gathered to sing patriotic songs. The militia regiments began to drill. It was a moment of national psychosis. A war fever swept the land, fueled by decades of pent-up industrial energy and national pride. The Americans were eager to prove that they were no longer a second-rate power. They were ready to take on the mistress of the seas. British alarm. In London, the news of Cleveland's message arrived with the morning papers on December 18th. The British public was bewildered. They had been paying almost no attention to the Venezuela issue. They regarded it as a minor border squabble in a jungle they couldn't find on a map. Suddenly, they opened their newspapers to find that the President of the United States was threatening to invade Canada and sink the Royal Navy. The initial reaction in Britain was one of shock and disbelief. They thought it must be a joke or a political stunt. They couldn't understand why their cousins across the Atlantic were so angry. But as the reports from the British ambassador in Washington began to arrive, the gravity of the situation sank in. This was not a stunt. The Americans were deadly serious. Lord Salisbury met with his cabinet. The mood was grim. They looked at the strategic board and for the first time realized they were in a trap of their own making. They had underestimated the Americans. They had assumed that British naval power was so overwhelming that no one would dare challenge it. But as the admirals began to run the numbers, the reality of a war with the United States began to look terrifying. Yes, the Royal Navy was larger, but its ships were scattered all over the globe protecting trade routes from Suez to Singapore. To fight the Americans, they would have to concentrate the fleet in the Atlantic. This would leave the empire naked in Asia and the Mediterranean. And the Americans had advantages that no other enemy possessed. They were uninvadable. The British Army was tiny compared to the potential manpower of the United States. Canada, the crown jewel of the British Empire in North America, was essentially a hostage. It had a thousands-mile-long border with the U.S. that was impossible to defend. If war broke out, American troops would march into Montreal and Toronto within weeks, and there was nothing Britain could do to stop them. Furthermore, the Americans had an industrial capacity that was terrifying. They could build ironclads and destroyers faster than British shipyards. A war with America would not be a quick colonial skirmish. It would be a grinding total war against a continent-sized nation with limitless resources. But the most immediate threat wasn't military. It was financial. On Wall Street, the threat of war caused a panic. On what became known as Black Friday, the stock market crashed. British investors who held billions of dollars in American railway stocks and bonds rushed to sell. The liquidity of the London market dried up. The City of London, the financial heart of the empire, sent a clear message to the government. A war with our biggest trading partner will bankrupt us. The German distraction. The British elite found themselves staring into the abyss. They were isolated. In Europe, the German Kaiser was growing increasingly belligerent. In Africa, the Boers were arming themselves. In the Far East, Russia and Japan were rising. Britain had no allies. It had prided itself on a policy of splendid isolation. Now, that isolation looked dangerous. Lord Salisbury, the man who had dismissed the Monroe Doctrine with a wave of his hand, was now faced with the most difficult decision of his life. He could stand his ground, fight for the honor of the empire, and plunge the world into a cataclysmic war over a patch of mosquitoes and gold dust. Or he could swallow his pride, admit that the world had changed, and bow to the demands of the American upstarts. As Christmas of 1895 approached, the world held its breath. The newspapers were filled with talk of ironclads and invasion routes. The telegraph cables between London and Washington hummed with coded messages. The British lion was crouching. The American eagle was screaming. And for the first time in 100 years, it wasn't clear who would blink first. In the first weeks of 1896, the world stood on a knife's edge. The United States and Great Britain were locked in a standoff that seemed destined for war. The American public was baying for blood, fueled by a nationalistic frenzy that saw the British Empire not as a cousin, but as a bully. The British government, led by Lord Salisbury, was cornered, trapped between its imperial pride and the terrifying reality of fighting a total war against an industrial giant across 3,000 miles of ocean. But history often turns on coincidences. Just as the tension over Venezuela reached its boiling point, a completely unrelated event on the other side of the world provided the distraction that saved the peace. On January 2nd, 1896, news reached London of a disaster in South Africa. A British colonial administrator named Leander Starr Jameson had led a botched illegal raid into the independent Boer Republic of the Transvaal. The Jameson raid was a fiasco. The British raiders were captured and humiliated. This was embarrassing enough, but what happened next changed the geopolitical calculus in London instantly. The German Kaiser Wilhelm II sent a telegram to the Boer president Paul Kruger, congratulating him on repelling the British invaders without appealing to the help of friendly powers. The Kruger telegram was a bombshell, a direct diplomatic insult to Great Britain. It implied that Germany was willing to support the Boers militarily against the British Empire. The British public, which had been focused on the American threat, suddenly spun around in fury. The anger toward Washington evaporated and was replaced by a burning hatred for Berlin. For Lord Salisbury, this was a gift from the gods. The German threat in Europe and Africa was real and dangerous. The American threat in Venezuela was, by comparison, a manageable legal dispute. The Kaiser had inadvertently clarified Britain's strategic priorities. Britain could not afford to be enemies with Germany and America at the same time. Splendid isolation was no longer splendid. It was suicidal. The British retreat Salisbury seized the opportunity to de-escalate the crisis with the United States. He used the German threat as cover to back down without looking weak. He signaled to Washington that Britain was willing to talk. The negotiations were delicate, but the British direction of travel was clear: surrender. In February of 1896, the British government agreed to the primary American demand. They would submit the Venezuela border dispute to a neutral arbitration tribunal. This was the blink. After months of saying, "Her Majesty's government will never submit," they submitted. They accepted the American Commission. They accepted the premise that the United States had the right to intervene. To save face, the British diplomats insisted on a few technical conditions. They argued that any British settlers who had lived in the disputed territory for 50 years should be allowed to stay regardless of where the line was drawn. The Americans, eager to declare victory without a war, agreed. It was a fig leaf to cover the British retreat, but everyone knew what had happened. The Monroe Doctrine had been enforced at gunpoint. The arbitration panel that met in Paris in 1899 was a strange spectacle. It was the closing act of the crisis, but the drama had already drained away. The panel consisted of 2 British judges, 2 American judges acting as the lawyers for Venezuela, because the British refused to sit with Venezuelans, and a neutral Russian diplomat. When the final decision was handed down, the irony was rich. The tribunal awarded Britain nearly 90% of the disputed territory. The Schomburg Line was largely upheld. The gold mines of the Uruari stayed in British hands. Britain got the land, but the United States got the hemisphere. The specific location of the border didn't matter. What mattered was the precedent. Britain had acknowledged that it could no longer act unilaterally in the Americas. It had acknowledged that Washington was the Supreme Court of the Western Hemisphere. The Great Rapprochement. This marked the beginning of a profound shift in British grand strategy known to historians as the Great Rapprochement. The British ruling class, deeply shaken by the crisis, engaged in a ruthless assessment of their global position. They looked at the rising power of Germany in Europe, the expansion of Russia in Asia, and the industrial explosion of the United States. They realized that the Victorian era of effortless dominance was over. They had to prioritize. They decided that the United States was the one power they could not defeat and therefore must befriend. If you can't beat them, join them. This wasn't a sentimental decision based on shared language or culture. It was cold, hard, realpolitik. The British realized that American industrial strength was becoming the fulcrum of the world economy. They realized that securing the friendship of the United States was the best insurance policy for the survival of the British Empire elsewhere. So began a systematic campaign of appeasement. Over the next decade, Britain quietly liquidated its strategic assets in the Western Hemisphere, handing them over to the United States one by one. The first sacrifice was the Panama Canal. For 50 years, Britain and the U.S. had been bound by the Clayton-Bulwer Treaty, which stated that any canal across Central America must be a joint British-American project. It prevented either nation from gaining a monopoly on the trade route. In 1901, the United States demanded a new deal. They wanted to build the canal themselves. They wanted to own it. They wanted to fortify it. In the past, Britain would have refused. Controlling the choke points of global trade was the very definition of British power. But now, the British just folded. They signed the Hay-Pauncefote Treaty, which gave the United States the exclusive right to build and control the Panama Canal. Britain asked for nothing in return. No territorial concessions, no cash. They simply gave away the most strategic waterway of the 20th century. It was a peace offering, an admission that the Caribbean was now an American lake. Then came the military withdrawal. For 2 centuries, the Royal Navy's North America and West Indies Squadron had been the symbol of British power in the Americas. Based in Bermuda, Halifax, and Jamaica, these ships had patrolled the coast, enforcing British will. In the early years of the 20th century, the First Sea Lord Admiral Jackie Fisher made a radical decision. He recalled the squadron. He scrapped the old gunboats and brought the battleships back to home waters to face the German threat in the North Sea. The British bases in the Caribbean were hollowed out. The garrisons were reduced. Britain essentially demilitarized its frontier with the United States. They made a calculated bet that they didn't need to defend Canada or Jamaica from the Americans anymore, because the Americans were now the de facto police force of the region. American expansion. This withdrawal created a power vacuum that the United States filled immediately. In 1898, just 3 years after the Venezuela Crisis, the United States launched the Spanish-American War. They kicked Spain out of Cuba and seized Puerto Rico. It was a blatant act of imperial expansion. And what did Britain do? Did they protest? Did they try to stop the Americans from seizing colonies? No. In fact, Britain was the only European power that supported the United States. While France and Germany sympathized with Spain, Britain encouraged the Americans. The British press cheered the U.S. victory. British diplomats kept the other European powers from intervening. It was the dawn of a new partnership. Britain was outsourcing the security of the West to Washington. This new dynamic was tested again in 1902 during the Venezuela debt crisis. Yes, Venezuela was in trouble again. The Venezuelan dictator Cipriano Castro refused to pay his debts to European bankers. Britain, Germany, and Italy sent their navies to blockade the Venezuelan coast. They shelled a few forts and seized some gunboats to force payment. President Theodore Roosevelt watched this with deep suspicion. He didn't mind the Europeans collecting debts, but he worried that Germany might use the debt as an excuse to seize territory in South America. Roosevelt issued a warning. He formulated the Roosevelt corollary to the Monroe Doctrine. He stated that the United States would act as an international police power in the Western Hemisphere. If a Latin American country misbehaved, the U.S. would intervene to fix it so that the Europeans wouldn't have to. He quietly warned the Germans to back off, and he warned the British too. The British reaction was telling. Instead of arguing, they immediately pulled their ships back. They deferred to Roosevelt. The British Prime Minister Arthur Balfour publicly stated that Britain would be happy to see the United States take on the role of policeman. "We should welcome any increase of the influence of the United States of America in the Western Hemisphere," he said. It was a complete reversal of the 1895 position. In 7 years, Britain had gone from threatening war over a borderline to inviting the Americans to run the continent. The long-term consequences. The consequences of this Great Rapprochement defined the 20th century. By avoiding war in 1895 and cultivating a junior partnership, Britain secured the ultimate ally. When World War I broke out in 1914, Britain was financially exhausted within 2 years. It was American loans and American industry that kept Britain fighting. If the Venezuela crisis had gone differently, if the two nations had remained enemies, the United States might have stayed neutral or even favored Germany. Instead, the special relationship forged in the humiliation of 1895 saved Britain from annihilation, but it saved Britain as a nation, not as a superpower. The Venezuela crisis was the moment the torch was passed. It wasn't a ceremony. It was a confrontation. The British Empire looked into the eyes of the American Republic and saw its own future. It saw a nation with more steel, more coal, more people, and more money. And it made the rational choice to step aside. The psychological impact on the British ruling class was profound. They began to view themselves less as the masters of the world and more as the Greeks to the American Romans, the wiser, older culture guiding the brash new power. It was a comforting myth that helped them accept their decline. For Venezuela, the result was a mixed blessing. They had been saved from British expansion, but they had fallen under American hegemony. The U.S. would dominate their politics and their oil industry for the next century. They learned that the Monroe Doctrine was not designed to protect Latin America from imperialism. It was designed to ensure that the only imperialism allowed was American. Today, if you visit the border region between Guyana and Venezuela, it is still a wild and beautiful place. The jungle has reclaimed the old mining camps, but the invisible line drawn through those trees represents the fault line of history. It is the place where the 19th century ended and the 20th century began. It is the place where the British lion turned tail. It is the place where the United States learned that it could give orders to the world, and the world would obey. The 1895 crisis is the forgotten prequel to the modern world. It proves that the most significant wars are often the ones that are never fought. Britain lost the Western Hemisphere without firing a shot, but in doing so, it gained the lifeline that allowed it to survive the storms to come. It was a humiliating climb down, but it was also perhaps the smartest diplomatic move in the history of the British Empire. They lost a continent, but they kept their existence. And in the ruthless game of empires, survival is the only victory that counts.